Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, host of the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. The following conversation originally appeared in episode 105 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com. And as we mentioned, our panel topic today will be Dungeons & Dragons tie-in novels, and we're joined by two guest geeks. So first up, we've got James L. Sutter, who you may remember from our panel on Dungeons & Dragons back in episode 49. He's the managing editor of Paizo Publishing and a co-creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game. He's also the author of the Pathfinder novel Death's Heretic, which ranked number 3 on Barnes & Noble's Best Fantasy of 2011. A sequel called The Redemption Engine will be out on April 30th. So James, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back.
And also joining us today is Wendy N. Wagner. She's the managing/associate editor of both Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines, and her short fiction appears in magazines such as Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and in books such as Armored and The Way of the Wizard. Her first novel, Skinwalkers, is a Pathfinder tie-in due out at the end of March. So Wendy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's great to be here, Dave.
All right, and so the first thing I want to talk about is just how we all got into Dungeons & Dragons tie-in novels. And I'll start. I talked about this a little bit last time we had James on the show, but I really got into all the Dungeons & Dragons stuff through video games. There was the first computer RPG I ever beat, actually, was this game called Fantasy by a company called SSI, who later got it a license to make official Dungeons & Dragons games. And the first one of those I got was called Heroes of the Lance. It was a Dragonlance tie-in, and that kicked off my interest in all things Dungeons & Dragons. And so I started reading the Dragonlance tie-in novels. The first one I read was this one called Stormblade, which honestly didn't make much of an impression on me. But I sort of went from that one to the Margaret Weis, Tracy Hickman Dragonlance Chronicles, and I just absolutely loved those. And I guess so. Those were the first ones I really got into. So how about Wendy? How did you get into Dungeons and Dragons novels?
Well, I remember when I was pretty young, there was a Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, and I just thought it was like the best thing ever. And
it was.
Yes, I'm glad I'm remembering that right. And so when I was at the library and found the Dragonlance books and I saw that magical word, Dungeons and Dragons, I just assumed they would be insanely awesome. And so I read like those first 2 trilogies that Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman put out, and I think I just loved them.
Mm-hmm. And James?
Yeah, so Richard Knack's original Dragon Realms series was one of the first fantasy series that I ever got into. And so they led me to The Legend of Huma, which was one of the early Dragonlance books. And from there, I just read a bajillion Dragonlance novels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and The Legend of Huma is great. I mean, that's one of my favorite of those books.
Yeah.
But so, Wendy, what are kind of your dominant memories of that first Dragonlance Chronicles series?
For me, there may as well have only been about like 2 characters in the book anymore. I just always loved like little Tasselhoff Burfoot, and I love all kinds of small hobbity kind of people. So I think he may have like left a long-term impression on me because I think I'd been read The Hobbit as a kid, but I hadn't read any serious fantasy until I read these Dragonlance books. I was probably 8 or 9 when I read them. Must have been about 9 or 10, I guess. And so I liked him. He just seemed, cute and funny. And I liked the way that whole series would like be like, okay, we're going to ramp up and have all this exciting action, and then somebody's going to be kind of funny. And I think that sort of imprinted in my brain, like perpetually, like this is what a book should be like. It should have like crazy madcap action, and then somebody should be funny.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we should say that those books were adapted straight from a series of role-playing modules. So there was a ton of combat and dungeon crawling kind of stuff in those books because that's what the game, the Dungeons and Dragons game mostly involves.
From a professional side, we often talk about sort of the Dragonlance effect, where they came out with those novels and those modules that were heavily tied together at around the same time. And it was just a beautiful blitz of all of this setting stuff that I think really contributed heavily to Dragonlance becoming so popular.
Yeah, I mean, it was very, I mean, just speaking for myself, it was very exciting to discover this whole, there was the video games and the books and the game books, and it was like this endless amount of stuff you could ask your parents to buy for you, all at once. But so, James, in terms of the characters in the story, does anything really stick out from those
So
Dragonlance Chronicles?
I'm gonna put the caveat on there right now that I read so many so long ago that they blur a little bit. But isn't that where Raistlin first showed up?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I love
And
him.
see, that was perfection right there because he was the bad boy character. You had a lot of other guys like, I remember reading about Tanis Half-Elven and being like, okay, yeah, he's cool, but like Raistlin was the guy who was sort of good and sort of bad, kind of like Han Solo, but with even like a slightly darker twist. And I think that it's those characters that have always called to me most, but I think that really called to folks in general a lot. I mean, I think people like the anti-heroes.
Hmm. I'll just say the one thing that really sticks in my mind about the Dragonlance Chronicles is that there's a character named Sturm Brightblade who, spoiler warning, dies in book 2. And that was one of the first books I read where a major character died, in the middle of the story. And it was totally devastating for me.
Somewhere a much younger George Martin is going, wait a second. Perfect.
But I agree that Raistlin is a terrific character, and particularly, I mean, I think the Dragonlance Chronicles is an okay story. Like I said, I think it suffers somewhat from being a straight adaptation of a role-playing game, but then they were able to take that character in the Dragonlance Legends trilogy that succeeded it, and I think that's a fantastic story. I mean, I should, like you, I should give the caveat that all my impressions of these books are based on 20-year-old memories, so I don't know how reliable
when we were 12, they were rad.
Raistlin in that second series is just like so awesome because at that stage, right, that's when he's like got like the gold skin and the hourglass eyes, and he's like crackling with this evil energy all the time. He's like amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the story of those books, as of that trilogy, as I remember it, is that Raistlin he's become a powerful enough wizard that he wants to challenge the evil god in this. Okay, so in this world, there's a good god, a neutral god, and an evil god, and he wants to challenge the evil god and kill her and take her place as the evil god of this world. And in order to do this, he has to somehow open up a portal to her realm, and the portal can only be opened. He needs the help of someone who's pure and good. To help open this portal, and so he has to corrupt this priestess named Lady Chrysania, and so there's just, I don't know, there's all sorts of really cool moral complexity to that, and he's like, again, spoiler warning, but come on, these books are 20 years old, and he succeeds, and then at the end of the story, his friends look up into the night sky and they see the constellation of the Dark Queen, Takesis, has been replaced by this is the constellation of Raistlin, who's now the evil god of the world. And man, it's just, I don't know, it's awesome stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, and actually, it's funny, because when you say something like that, I feel like the issue of does the fiction series, how does it impact the setting is actually a big part of what people either love or hate about tie-in novels for RPGs, right? Because, like, you've got, it's tempting with novels to always have things change and have big effects on sort of the grander world stage, except that if you do that, you risk invalidating all the game books that people already bought and the campaigns they're already playing in, right? So
I thought that was the plan, and then they have to buy all the new game books.
But it makes people really mad. I mean, the fallout after like the Forgotten Realms got blown up, a lot of fans were really mad about that. And it's
well, James, why don't you explain a little bit more about what that was?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. That's somebody else's IP, so I don't want to throw any stones because I totally understand the desire to reboot everything. But I also think that there's a legitimate fan backlash if you take a setting, get everybody really invested in it, have them playing their games in it, and then have say, never mind, we're going to take all that and put it on the shelf or actively destroy it, and then bring in this new setting.
Well, but I think what we should explain for people who don't follow this stuff is that they released the second edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and they had changed they changed a lot of the rules completely. And so then they had, within the fiction of the Forgotten Realms, they had this period called the Time of Troubles, where there was this gigantic cataclysm, and that explains why
Well,
everything
and
is different.
that also isn't the only time that's happened. I mean, it's happened more recently also with, Forgotten Realms and with other settings. And I think it's always a very dangerous proposition for a company. That's one of the reasons why. So my day job is managing the novels for Paizo, for the Pathfinder role playing game. And from the beginning, our one of our ethoses was always that we're not going to let the novels ruin the world or change the world too much, because you're not the only people invested in that. Like, role-playing games are this weird sort of intersection between fiction, which is a very, as the author, you have total control, and this wider community-based thing. And so it's really important to not invalidate everything that's come before, because there are a lot more people than just, an author who feel like they have investment and control of the setting.
Mm-hmm. See, Wendy, we're talking about these Forgotten Realms setting. Did you ever read the Forgotten Realms stuff?
Oh, I did. I really liked Dritz Stoward and his. I think I read probably the first two trilogies, or maybe just the first one for sure. And then I think I started reading the later books where he's like not underground. But I really liked that first series with you're in like the Dro underground realm, and you're exploring all these weird tunnels, and there's all this like dark stuff, and Dritz is a little bit like Raceland, he's a little bit of this dark dude who's like, opposed to everything in his civilization, weight of the world is on his shoulders, and I always really liked him.
Yeah, absolutely. Homelands by R.A. Salvatore, which is the first of the Dark Elf trilogy, is absolutely one of my favorites of these books. And it's about a society of, the Dark Elves are an evil race of elves who live underground, and Dritz is a rare Dark Elf who's born with a conscience and the problems he has. Actually, we interviewed R.A. Salvatore on this show a while back, episode 49, I guess, because it's when James was on. So you should definitely check that out. He told some awesome stories about that.
That'd be great.
He is a fascinating dude to talk to. Like, just his perspective on how the whole Dark Elf thing, Drist came to be. It was a lot of these split-second decisions that ended up, defining his whole writing career. So I'm curious what you guys' favorite of the older campaign settings were. We've, talked about two of them. What was the best to you?
Wendy?
It's hard to say. I mean, I never played Dungeons and Dragons, so I only know D&D from the books. And so, thinking back, I'm gonna have to say Forgotten Realms, just because I do tend to really appreciate dark fiction so much, and I think that there is a lot of darkness in at least those first books. I haven't read any further in the Forgotten Realms than that, but I'd say the Forgotten Realms.
Actually, I'm going to say Dark Sun, but right before I get to that, I just want to mention, apparently, wait, who's the guy who invented Forgotten Realms? Was it Ed Greenwood?
Ed Greenwood.
Yeah, so I was just reading the Wikipedia entry, and apparently he claims that his Forgotten Realms was a lot darker than how it eventually got published as. So that's one thing that's interesting. But I also wanted to mention...
surprising.
I also wanted to mention this thing. It says... Greenwood noted that TSR, that's the company that used to publish Dungeons & Dragons, altered his original conception of the realms being a place that we could travel to from our world. Quote, concerns over possible lawsuits of kids getting hurt while trying to find a gate led TSR to de-emphasize this meaning.
Wow. Wow.
So wait, why do you say that's not surprising? Is Ed Greenwood notably morose or something?
No, he's not. Ed's a great guy. He's a friend of mine. He's done some work for Pathfinder too, but he's just he likes to push the envelope. Not in terms of gore usually, but he's kind of a raunchy dude, but in this gleeful sort of way. He's basically like filthy Santa Claus. And if you ever meet him at a convention, he's very much got that like twinkle in his eye, will say, you never know what he'll say because he'll say anything to get a rise. But at the same time, he's this wonderfully generous, lovable dude. And I've asked him before. It's like, Ed, how do you do this? Because anybody else who said and did what you do would probably be in jail by now. But instead, everybody just is like, oh, Ed, yeah, he is a riot.
Huh. Well, I mean, speaking of Filthy Santa Claus, that just makes me think that the cover art and so on for all these Dungeons and Dragons books was often incredibly sexualized.
Yeah.
With babes in what do you call chainmail bikini
Chainmail
kind of
bikinis.
stuff, right? Wendy, when you were reading these as a girl, what was your impression of all this really sexual imagery on the art?
Well, I mean, you're talking about the late 80s and early 90s, and the vast majority of fantasy and science fiction covers just look like that. I mean, you go into the video store and you've got Death Stalker, and it's all naked chicks in blue bikinis, and there's more fabric in their boots than there is in anybody's outfit. I just thought that's what books were like, really, I think.
I think it really, the 80s sort of represented, I don't know if the apex, but kind of the end of that philosophy regarding book covers being the most common. I mean, it's still around, but I guess it represented a turning point. Because, that philosophy had been around since the days of the old pulp magazines in the, 30s and 40s and whatnot, where the idea was that these were stories for boys, quote unquote, and you were really targeting that young teenage demographic who also, incidentally, had zero access to any sort of scantily clad women imagery, and so it really benefited you to have that extra sex appeal. But I think that honestly, with the rise of the internet and the fact that your book cover can never compete with the untold millions of pornographic images that your reader can pull up on his smartphone in class if he feels like it, I really think, I mean, it's true. Every 12-year-old boy lives like a Roman emperor these days. It's if he wants naked pictures, the sky is the limit. And so I think that, I mean, my personal opinion is that now, doing that chainmail bikini cheesecake cover is really a detriment to your line, because I think that it doesn't have the same appeal for that market that was its original target, and it also doesn't have. I mean, it drives away both, honestly, most women who are going to be like, "What? Seriously?" And just sort of feminists of all genders and sects. But also it's going to drive away all the grown-ups who are like, I really don't want to be seen reading this on the bus. And obviously, some grown-ups are perfectly happy to read that on the bus, but I think that really the day of that being a boon for your book is over.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta say, I am super happy with my cover from Pathfinder. The main character, you can see her neck, her face, and her hands. Everything else, she looks like she's out in the snow. She's dressed in heavy duty gear, and it's great. She's fully clad. All you really tell about her is that she's a giant weapon slinging troublemaker.
Turns out armor needs to cover the skin to be useful.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because I mean, one of my favorite of the Dungeons and Dragons books is Azure Bonds by Jeff Grubb and Kate Novak. And it has one of the most gratuitous chainmail bikini kind of covers you've ever seen, and it's so notable. This armor is so notably impractical that they actually have to address it in the book, and they explain that there's an invisible magical shield protecting her breast, so that when enemies try to stab her there, their weapons just bounce off.
And you know what's sad is I'm looking at that cover right now, and it's actually not even that bad compared to a lot of the other terrible, at least she's wearing pants of a sort, Yeah, it's crazy.
All right, cool. But getting back to our favorite campaign settings, I said, I think my favorite was the Dark Sun campaign setting, which is basically it's like a fantasy Mad Max. It's like a post-apocalyptic epic fantasy where out of control magic has destroyed the ecology of this world, and it's all devolved into gladiator combat and you know bandits and stuff like that.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah, I think the more extreme ones, like you say, like Dark Sun, were always the ones that appealed to me, even though I didn't have access to a lot of information about them as a kid. I always thought that Dark Sun was really interesting, but hands down, my favorite was always Planescape, just because it had the most weirdness, right? Like what I look for in any setting is how much variety is there to your monsters, to your landscapes, and Planescape was all about infinite variety, and I always found that fascinating. I mean, to be perfectly honest, like both of the novels that I've written 20 years ago would have been Planescape novels because I love that idea, all the different sort of realms of the afterlife or planes or whatever you want to call them kind of coming together is just fascinating to me.
I mean, are there any particular Planescape novels that stick out in your mind?
The great irony of this is that I never actually managed to run across a Planescape novel. Honestly, it was one of those things where, like, which of these books I read as a kid was often determined by either what setting my group was playing in or just who had the books that they could loan me. That sort of thing.
Do any books stick out in your mind as being particularly your least favorites of the Dungeons and Dragons books?
I mean, so I'm just gonna throw out there that my personal policy, especially because I work in the industry, but just in general, is to sort of never spit on anybody's art because I know how much goes into it. But I will say that, I read probably 40 RPG tie-in novels as a kid, of which before this interview I could remember the titles of like 5. So I think that some of those clearly were forgettable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it certainly seemed to me. I mean, I actually kind of got turned off on reading epic fantasy for a long time because I read, like you, 30 or so Dragonlance type novels, and I really felt like as they went on that quality control was, lacking a little bit. And particularly, the thing that really got to me is there was a series where they were kind of prequels, and they had the characters having bigger adventures when they were young than they had later on, and you never heard of any of this stuff before, and it just completely undermines the believability of the whole setting.
I actually feel like I kind of went I kind of went 360 degrees because like I read a ton of RPG tie-in stuff when I was a kid. And then I got this idea that like, I thought of it in my mind as corporate fantasy, stuff with a logo on the cover. I started to see how it was a commodity and a product, and I was like, well, this can't be good art, right? Because they're just shoving out as many as they can. And like, why would you bother with quality control if you don't need it to sell it? But certainly that happens. But now I feel like I've sort of come around to the other side and realized that, like, actually, while it is all about quality control, there's nothing about RPG tie-in fiction that says that it can't be good fiction. Like, it's often good authors, authors whose, original stuff you'd like. Why would you not like their tie-in stuff? And some authors are better doing tie-in than doing original stuff. If your thing is characters and plot and not world building, then coming into a world where you can just pick and choose the best elements is a huge boon, actually. So I think I had a definite sort of post-teenage backlash against the whole idea, and now I've come back to thinking there's really not a big difference as long as the editors are doing their job.
Yeah, I've been kind of in the same boat. I read all those Dragonlance and Dritz books when I was probably definitely all under the age of 14. I didn't really read anything, any other tie-ins for a long time, partially because, I've always been the kind of person that gets their books at the libraries, and I pretty much tapped out everything my library had. And then, I don't know, probably about 5 years ago, I kind of turned around and the tie-in fiction I've been reading, I've really enjoyed. Not just I don't know that I don't think I've read anything that's tied into the Dungeons and Dragons, but I do read the Pathfinder books even before I started, getting into the game and meeting James, and I really enjoy them.
Well, yeah, I really wonder about. I've never written any tie-in stuff, and I really wonder what the advantages and disadvantages are to it. I mean, it seems to me that the disadvantage you have some of the same disadvantages as a long-running series, where more and more stuff gets locked in, and it makes it harder to say like, oh, well, this character went to this city and then came here because like, no crap, I already drew the map, and like all my readers know that he couldn't make the journey in that time, and I can't change it now. There's that kind of stuff, but on the other hand, you don't have to make up freaking everything. I mean, I've heard George R. R. Martin talk about this, where when you're writing epic fantasy, you get to a certain point where you're like, okay, they come to a mountain. It's like, God damn it, what are these mountains called? You have to make something up, and you don't have this whole world to draw on.
Yeah, I mean it's both. It is both manacles and an incredible support team, right? You don't get to just say, oh well, he can just do that because magic. Like, if there's a magic system in place, you need to stay within the bounds of that magic system, or your readers will know and they'll call you on it. It'll knock them out of their suspension of disbelief. But at the same time, I mean, how many authors get to have essentially a huge support team doing their world building for them, and you can just sort of focus on the elements that you like and ignore the ones that you don't, and suddenly here's all that work that not only would you have had to do, but also I think that most worlds benefit from having multiple imaginations working at the same time. I one of the things I love about my job is getting to play with all of these things that my coworkers have created. Where it's like, I'm fascinated by hell, so my coworker Wes is like the hell guy, and I love seeing what he comes up with, and then I can steal it and put it in my own books, and everybody, that's okay. It's one of the few times where creative plagiarism is encouraged rather than discouraged.
It's a little bit like working within like if you write poetry, there are forms, right? So like you have to write a haiku, and there are very strict rules about writing haiku, but somehow following those rules can sort of break you out of old kind of writing ruts and give you a whole new dimension of looking at character and looking at story and how it all comes together. I think it's pretty dang fun.
Well, I mean, James, as an industry professional, can you give any do you have any idea how these Dungeons and Dragons books came about in the first place? Like, whose idea was it, and who were the authors? Were they people who worked for TSR, or did they recruit authors? Or
I mean, so I think that often it was people who worked for TSR, and I'm not a super scholar on the very old stuff, but my understanding is that a lot of that stuff, it was originally people in house. I believe that actually and I may get this wrong, I'm forgetting the name of the guy who did the Moonshae books.
Douglas Niles?
Yeah, the very early Forgotten Realms. The way I hear it, they decided they wanted fiction and talked to him, and actually he already had a novel or more that he'd been writing sort of independently, and he kind of reskinned it to fit it into the Forgotten Realms, which is why it's set in those isles as opposed to... So yeah, exactly, right? Like, you look back and you're like, oh, I guess that makes sense. But I mean, I think in a lot of cases it was either people who were on the inside or sort of tangentially related, because they were starting something new. I think as time went on, you saw more and more sort of outside authors being pulled in. But I think it started as very much a grassroots in-house thing, as far as I know.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, 'cause wasn't Margaret Weiss an editor at TSR, like at the time and when they started writing those books?
It could very well be. I would not be surprised at all.
See, Wendy, John said that you wanted to be Margaret Weiss when you grew up.
I did. I think when I was about probably 10 or 11, I just, part of the reason why I ever picked out these books is because they were by, I, like a dodo as a kid, thought that it was by two girls. And I just thought that
you know what? I thought that until I met Tracy Hickman. So you're not the only one.
I'm pretty sure they've got author photos out there somewhere. Anyway, I just remember thinking like, wow, these people must be so cool. They write these exciting books. I just think that Margaret Weiss just would be the coolest person to be when I grow up. And, I guess I'm halfway to that goal, maybe.
Well, and it's funny because like Margaret is the reputation I've always heard of her is that she is basically the nicest woman in gaming. And that's certainly been my experience as well. So a good role model to aspire to.
Excellent.
Well, let's see. I mean, these settings have so much detail. You almost must have to do like a research project to be able to write a book set in like the Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms, right? I mean, how much does an individual author have to know about these settings before they can write a book set in it?
I mean, the more the better as far as I'm concerned. But that said, I consider, and I don't know if this is true of everybody, but I consider my job as the editor to sort of also be the research assistant and take as much of that burden off an author as possible, because I know that we've got hundreds of books that we've published over just the last like 5 years, and I don't expect authors to read all of that. I couldn't read all of that if I didn't work here. So I really try to talk to authors and find out. I'll give them like the setting Bible and say, okay, well, here's sort of the top level thing of what all these nations are about. What sort of story do you want to do? What catches your eye as you flip through? And then if somebody says something, I want to do this type of story, then I try to point them toward the region where that would fit best. Or if they say, I really want a cleric of a good god, then I'd say, oh, okay, well, do you want Sarenrae or do you want, Iomade, like these various things, because it can be totally overwhelming. At the same time, I think the ability to sit down with something like the Inner Sea World Guide, which is our setting Bible, and just flip through looking at pictures until you see something that speaks to you. I mean, as an author, that's kind of great, right? Like that sort of prompt gets you past the terror of the blank page.
I was going to say, I think James does a really good job. The way that he's supported me in my work is, I started with that Inner Sea World Guide, but every project, James was really good about saying, okay, well, here's some fiction that came from that area, and here's an extra information about these monster types that you're going to be running into. So there's a lot of like sub publications, smaller things that I think a lot of people who aren't experts or aren't expert players would really not even know how to find. And so it's great to have somebody with those extra resources to help you flesh things out. And also, Pathfinder Wiki, holy smokes.
Yeah, well, actually, and that's huge, is the fans are actually a big help, because you've got, wikis and things. I mean, I bet that all the major campaign settings have them, but we use the Pathfinder Wiki, which is fan-run, internally all the time, because it's faster for me to figure out, using that, all the different places we've mentioned a character than trying to do it all by hand. I've got internal tools as well, but I really love when I've got authors who use that sort of resource to really dig down and get that extra information. It adds a lot of verisimilitude when an author can name drop small things that aren't even really related to the research material that I sent them. But like the little details really make it clear that they are kind of living in that world, which is above and beyond. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. I think this might be a good time to sort of explain to people who don't know what the relationship is between Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. Right, so my understanding is that there was kind of a schism in the Dungeons and Dragons community with the release of the 4th edition rules, which I guess a lot of people felt changed it into basically a different game. And then some people felt that they preferred the older 3.5 edition rules that were closer to the original Dungeons and Dragons rules. And so the Pathfinder game kind of came out of the people who wanted to stick to the closer to the original rules, but since they didn't own the Dungeons and Dragons IP, they had to invent new content for the world.
Yeah, for a pen and paper role playing game, it was a lot like a technology. The paradigms are very technology-ish, because 3.5, which was the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons, was open source. Anybody could use that rules set. Which was a brilliant move that Wizards of the Coast had made, because it got everybody using the same system. When 4th edition came out, there wasn't as much backward compatibility as people wanted, and it was much more of a closed system. It wasn't as open source. And so, we as a business ultimately decided, like we heard a lot of our fans saying, we want to keep what we have. We don't want to switch and rebuy everything and sort of start from scratch. We've got bookshelves full of this stuff. So the idea with Pathfinder was that we would take the open source 3.5 rules, we would update them and make the changes that we felt had always needed to be made, simplifying things that were too complicated and, boosting things that weren't powerful enough. And really just release that as our sort of updated version of 3.5. And then we would publish it as Pathfinder because, of course, those old 3.5 rulebooks would no longer be in print, and you can't base your company on a game where the core rulebooks aren't in print. So we had to come out with our own stuff. And then it was a scary time for us, like, to be perfectly honest. We had no idea. I mean, Dungeons & Dragons was the 800-pound gorilla. By splitting off, I thought maybe I'd go back to grad school. But it turns out that people really stuck with us, and stuck with the game and allowed us to build Pathfinder into now what's the best-selling role-playing game, which has been a really crazy ride for all of us.
Mm-hmm. And you were saying that a lot of the Dungeons & Dragons authors have kind of come along with you, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, both in terms of on staff, like lots of people. I mean, because Paizo, before Pathfinder, published the Dungeons & Dragons magazines under license from Wizards. So we were all working on official Dungeons & Dragons stuff before we switched over. And, some of those folks had been there for a really long time. There are authors, like Sean Reynolds, who came to work at Paizo, went all the way back to the TSR days, and so we definitely pulled a lot of those people both on our staff and then certainly on our authors. I mean, I've had in the novel line been able to bring in people like, Ed Greenwood, who created the Forgotten Realms, and Elaine Cunningham, who was a very prominent Forgotten Realms author, and Dave Gross, who wrote for some of those settings as well. We've really been able to draw a lot of those people, while at the same time finding new people, because I believe that new blood is really important. And actually, I'm thrilled when I get authors who have never done tie-in stuff before who want to work for Pathfinder, because I feel like I really want to heal that divide where people say, oh, well, I read fantasy, but I wouldn't read tie-in, or, people who love tie-in but don't read a lot outside. Like, I really think that we can kind of just be one big community.
Mm. Well, I mean, Wendy, speaking of some new blood here coming in, do you just want to say what your experience was? Like, how did your book come about, and what was it like writing in the Pathfinder setting and stuff like that?
Sure. Well, I had never played Pathfinder. I had only, I think at the time when I was talking to James, I maybe started reading maybe something by Elaine Cunningham. I wasn't sure, but I knew nothing about the world. But I'd done a lot of short fiction. I'd written a bunch of novels that hadn't gone anywhere. And, because James knew the Ink Punks, he had done this blog post for us about what it's like to write tie-in fiction. And I messaged him on Twitter saying, whoa, that was a cool blog post. I'd totally get into that gig. It just seems like a great world to work in. He was like, oh, well, send me a submissions packet. So I'd been thinking on applying to write for Wizards of the Coast. And so I submitted to James, and he thought I showed some potential. So I started out writing. I wrote one web serial, a 3-part story about a lady who's a former pirate named Gendara. And the fans really seemed to like it. And they were incredibly encouraging. And their feedback was so positive that James said, well, let's see if you got a book in you. So I came up with some ideas, and he finally helped me figure out what we should do. And so we wrote this book. I say we wrote this book together. I wrote the book. All the genius parts, I think, really came from James, though.
Yeah, and see, I'd say Wendy did all the work. But actually, I think what really got to me about her character was I feel like it's so rare that you see a single mother in fantasy being like a total badass Viking pirate. Just like that. The combination of this is a, butt-kicking, Conan-style, like, fighter lady who also is a devoted single mother, like struggling with the issues around that. And I thought that that had some real heart, and that it was something I hadn't seen a lot in RPG fiction. I really always want to kind of push the boundaries of what is just sort of the standard content one would think of for an RPG tie-in novel, because this is a world where any type of story can be told.
I was in a bookstore a couple years ago, and I don't know, this kid came in. I think he was maybe 12 or something with his dad, and he just picked up all the R.A. Salvatore Dritz books and said, "I want these." And his dad kind of looked at them and said, "Oh, this is what you want for your birthday?" And the kid's like, "Yeah, yeah." And so he got him. And that kind of made me happy to see that kids are still buying those books. Because I have the sense, I don't know, I mean, maybe it's just because I'm not 12 anymore, but I don't have a sense of how many people are still reading the Dragonlance Chronicles and stuff. And I did hear an interview with Tracy Hickman where he and Margaret Weiss had written the latest Dragonlance book, but in the meantime, was it Wizards? You can correct me. Wizards of the Coast had been acquired by Mattel or something like that. And
Wizards is owned by Hasbro. And
has Hasbro. And he said that like they couldn't, like he had sent in the latest book and just nobody responded to him, and that then this went on for months. And this is this guy who's written 13 something New York Times bestselling books, and it was just like nobody at like books were such a low priority at Hasbro that nobody would even like. It wasn't that they didn't like the book or anything; they just couldn't even. Nobody would bother getting around to looking at it. And I don't know. I just wonder what is the current status of those official Dungeons and Dragons books. Are they still big? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it depends. And I mean, publishing is, and especially game publishing, is kind of a swamp no matter how you look at it. Like there's lots of people who are very passionate, but publishing's a hard business, and things, there's not always as much money in it as people think there are. And so you can end up with a lot of people trying to, catch assignments here or there as they can. So I have no idea what went on there, but I guess the status of a lot of the older campaign settings really depends. I know that Wizards has relaunched some of the old ones, and that there's new fiction. I mean, there was even a new Dark Sun book. I think I saw that Robert Schwall wrote a new Dark Sun book a couple years ago. So they're still putting out some material, and I believe that Margaret Weiss either has or had for a while the license to do Dragonlance stuff for her own company. She's got her own publishing company that she does all her writing for. So I mean, on the one hand, I think that there's definitely still love for those old settings. At the same time, I also completely understand from a business sense why people want to push new things. Those old books aren't going to make you nearly the same sort of money as if you can get something new and fresh that catches on. So I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see the Birthright setting suddenly rise to the top again. Because I think people are more focused on trying to get the new out there.
Well, I mean, speaking of the new, James, you want to tell us about your new book, The Redemption Engine?
I would love to. So The Redemption Engine is a sequel to Death's Heretic, which was my first novel. And it's set in the Pathfinder world. And it's all about this main character, Salim, who's comes from our atheist nation of Rahadum, but of course, being an atheist in a world where gods are objectively, provably real, makes for kind of a weird life for him. Because, I mean, like any cleric walking down the street, if you say, "Is God real?" they can just cast a divination spell and ask God, and God will be like, "Yup." And so there's, how do you deal with that? And so, of course, he ends up through some fairly major mistakes in his life, ending up working for the goddess of death as kind of an enforcer, tracking down souls that have gone missing. And in the Redemption Engine, it's very much a story of him trying to track down all these souls that are being stolen essentially from hell. Somebody is murdering sinners, and then the souls are never making it to hell. So the devils are naturally really upset about that because they're being denied their due. But there's also these questions of like, well, but is stealing from devils really wrong? And like, if if these souls are escaping judgment, that's bad, but at the same time, um, is it wrong to rob the devil and sort of like chip away at his power? So there's lots of kind of moral ambiguity and crazy monsters and weird cultures and characters. Because like I said about Planescape, I really love the more bizarre landscapes and creatures, the better.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the religious themes kind of reminds me of something else about Dragonlance I had wanted to bring up. In the Dragonlance Legends series, we find the characters end up traveling back in time to before an event called the Cataclysm, which was this big world destroying event that was in the had happened previously before the original series picks up. And there's this he's kind of like the Pope. He's called the King Priest of Ishtar, and he demands of the gods that they destroy all the evil creatures in the world. And the gods are so upset about this that they throw a fiery mountain down on top of him, and this breaks the world, and also all hell breaks loose. And I don't know, I just thought that was always really cool that these fantasy books are dealing with that kind of those kinds of themes.
Yeah, I mean that question of like first off, alignment arguments are like one of the great nerd arguments and have been for 30 or 40 years at this point. What is actually good versus actually evil, and do the ends justify the means? And like, honestly, all of those metaphysical arguments that stretch back to the dawn of time. But I really enjoy it in the context of a game where we say, at least in Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and games like that, there's an absolute alignment system. So you say, well, these angels are creatures of pure good, and these devils are creatures of pure lawful evil. But how does that actually work when you start interacting with people, right? And what is the interaction between lawful and good? Does good mean that you follow all the laws, or does good mean that you follow some of the laws, except for sometimes? Like, I think that you can argue endlessly about that, and I'm fascinated by it. I mean, that's actually like one of the great internal, because we have these battles internally all the time about alignment systems. One of my favorite things I've put in the campaign setting is there's this island called Hermea where there's a gold dragon, and gold dragons are always lawful good, or at least presented as always lawful good, running what's essentially a giant eugenics experiment because he feels like humans aren't living up to their potential. They're always killing each other and being nasty. And so he runs this thing where he invites the best and the brightest to his island to come make a utopia, except that you have to agree to basically defer to his judgment in all things. And he really is trying to breed the human race, which on the one hand you're like, well, I see where he's coming from, but then as soon as you put it in the context of like, well, isn't that kind of eugenics? Then everybody's like, but so is he lawful good or not? Or is that actually evil? And I'm not in the business of telling people, one or the other, but I think that the debate itself is really useful, and that moral ambiguity is one of the ways the game can really kind of help us have conversations that we maybe wouldn't have in our normal lives.
See, Wendy, do you have any reactions to any of this stuff?
Well, I was just thinking, like, one of the really fun things that we worked on kind of in, like, the revision process of my novel was sort of looking at, this crux at the heart of the character of Gendara. She was a pirate. She was a thief and a crook and a criminal who killed and murdered people for her own gain. And now she's trying to, lead this good life and be like a good mom and be a good person and find a new place in her community. And James was really careful to like not let her just brush her past under the rug or just justify it to be like, oh no, we didn't really hurt anybody. He really wanted her to have this this dark side of her that she has to live with every single day. And I just think like that's to me the best part of the book, and I'm really glad that James encouraged that. And I think it comes from him having this interest in exploring the moral issues inside the game world.
I feel like it's really important to have that sort of reality to characters. I think that nobody you meet in the real world is totally good or totally evil. So why would they be in your fiction or, in your game fiction? And that's something that has been really interesting to watch the fan reaction. Because I've helmed the novel line since its its inception. And so my tastes there are definitely well represented. And I do occasionally see people saying, can't we just have heroes who are just heroic? Like, I just want my paladin who does the right thing all the time and never has to question or doubt. And, the way I feel is that if you never have to question the righteousness of your cause, you're probably not a good guy.
Yeah.
I think that absolute confidence leads to corruption. And so I think that, well, I do try to give people, some paladins and some good characters who aren't just like, who are more than just 51% good. I do think that it's important to show well-rounded characters who have a wide variety of, foibles going along with their good traits.
All right, cool. So this has turned out to be a really appropriate panel to go along with my Richard Garriott interview. So that's really
Yay.
good. But we should probably start wrapping this up now. So, so James, let's see, the Redemption Engine. Do people need to read Death's Heretic to read the Redemption Engine?
No, it stands alone. That said, if you want to pick Death's Heretic up, Redemption Engine doesn't come out for 2 months, so there's still time to get all caught up.
And is this going to be a trilogy?
I in my heart of hearts, I would like it to be, which would sort of make this my Empire Strikes Back. But that still is yet to be determined. Right now, they're both standalone novels that I think benefit from reading each other, but I don't think that you have to.
Mm-hmm. And so, Wendy, what do you have coming up in the future?
Well, Skinwalkers comes out at the end of this month, so that's really exciting. And then I've also been working on all this great stuff for Lightspeed for the Women Destroy Science Fiction and Women Destroy Horror and Women Destroy Fantasy. So a lot of projects going on.
All right, great. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So James L. Sutter, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Wendy N. Wagner, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve.
And that was our panel. Hope you enjoyed it. For more interviews and panels, visit us at geeksguideshow.com. Thanks.